Collapsing America plays world leader? Who would ever sit at the table with an enemy on the verge of implosion? American politicians have sacrificed national security for decades in the pursuit of national superiority. Further arms deliveries to Ukraine will not guarantee Kiev victory, but will only lead to an escalation. This is not in the interest of the United States, which should primarily take care of its own people. Some may ask the U. Political leadership, whatever faction it may belong to, whether it has recognized that the United States is no longer the boss of the world. If the answer is no, it would require an extensive update dossier that would have to be delivered to the desk of the incumbent president very quickly. There is no more time. We repeat, there is no more time. The United States is in the midst of a political crisis that is afflicting the entire West, which happens to be directly influenced by the United States, and has not yet managed to solve it. This is a major disadvantage internationally, because all around them there is a world that is evolving in a multipolar direction, with a large number of governments and peoples who no longer want to remain under the thumb of the invader and are rebelling. Some through markets, some through partnerships, some through revolutions. In all of this, the US is in the midst of a social crisis that reflects the unprecedented political crisis. The downfall of the West, as Oswald Spengler put it, is louder than people think. No one cares about Americans anymore because there are basically no politicians who care about America anymore, while they tend to have their own interests in mind. This process of separation of governance, representation, and population is one of the most delicate points of a transitional period that will lead all of humanity to rethink the political processes through which societies organize themselves. The problem is that the US is still an imperialist political system with tentacles all over the world, and the dollar has been the main currency dominating the planet for almost a century. Therefore, the consequences of this debacle will be equally unprecedented. The final metastasis of a sick society cannot be avoided. The American generational problem is very much reflected in the country's foreign policy. While there is a masterful agreement with the long-term planning laid down at the beginning of the 20th century, it is equally true that things have not gone as strategists and analysts expected. You have to come to terms with reality now. The US has a very exclusive, lobbyist, elitist education system that is tied to a few power groups whose dependence on the matrices in London and Tel Aviv makes it difficult for candidates to succeed. Instead, the masses have been given an education that has led to general impoverishment, a sudden decline in skills, and irreparable cultural damage, setting in motion a process that sustains itself through its own successes, which are actually failures. Who will think of the Americans in the future? While bellicose rhetoric continues, the US is being destabilized by unprecedented illegal immigration. Social protests are being crushed with violence or a few doses of new cheap psychiatric drugs, and new mass entertainment is being produced to keep protest within tolerable limits. Perhaps no one really cares about what will happen in the new world on the other side of the Atlantic. Or maybe they are interested enough to let the murderer die his own death. From a strategic point of view, the situation is well known. The Western Front, ça va sans dire, has never brought any real military advantage. Untold sums have been spent on the supply of weapons of all kinds to Ukraine, from older weapons taken from the post-Soviet arsenals to newer ones that have been produced hand in hand with the still ongoing training of Ukrainian commanders and special forces who, it should be remembered, have not yet been involved in the conflict. Instead, conscripts and reservists were sent. The countries that supported the conflict on the western side had to change their national budgets to meet Zelensky's demands and transform their economies into war economies where this was more or less possible and expedient. At the behest of the United States of America, the whole of Europe has entered a slow phase of rearmament, the likes of which has not been seen since the Second World War. The colorful industrial defense machinery has earned defense companies billions of dollars. How many F-16s have been delivered to Ukraine? How many F-35s are currently being prepared? How many ATACMS are currently being discussed in Congress? And what missile models are on the agenda of the European Parliament, which is a perfectly obedient vassal? We have become accustomed to hearing about guns as if we were talking about sports competitions with our favorite athletes, and we cheer and get excited when we hear the cost of a device that can kill thousands of people. But war is not a game, not a joke. Although the possibility of hitting Russia further and harder could raise the morale of Ukrainians, it is the fight on the ground that will determine the outcome of the conflict, and it is there that Kiev loses. Even in terms of information warfare, there are no longer any particular results, and now even the mainstream media is realizing that something is wrong. The Allies understandably have sympathy for Ukraine, despite NATO's ill-considered push to the Russian border. However, their first responsibility is for their own nations, which is why they have never kept their infamous 2008 promise to admit Ukraine and Georgia to the Transatlantic Alliance. The proxy war blurs the fine line between war and peace. How much longer will the patience of other international actors observing events be abused? The prospect is that of a global escalation in which the majority is no longer on the side of the Americans, and that is now an indisputable fact. The US is exposed to a number of very serious risks, and if it does not take them into account, the damage will be irreparable. This is understandable when you consider that the special military operation is not a conventional war, and was deliberately conducted according to the strategic criteria of a total hybrid war from the beginning. The Americans never wanted to try to win the conflict immediately, otherwise they would have pursued a different strategy, which would have been more militarily aggressive and would have involved European countries in a blitzkrieg from the beginning. Instead, the entire West was slowly reorganized in an anti-multipolar manner, which ran counter to the initiatives already promoted before February 2022 by Russia, China, and other countries that freed themselves from Anglo-American hegemony. This has led Europe into an abyss more than before, after nearly a century of military occupation, political subjugation, economic enslavement, and cultural devastation. Now there is no other choice, either a total revolution or participation in the final act of this macabre theater, the direction of which will definitely make a profit, whether in the short or long term. A very important strategic principle is never to sacrifice anything or someone if you can't gain something by doing so, and the US knows this very well. During the US election campaign, we keep hearing about diplomacy to try to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. Or perhaps it is really about resolving the internal war in the USA? Because to be honest, diplomacy makes no sense without a stable nation. With what credibility does the USA still allow itself to raise its voice against the rest of the world? So the question is, what will be left after that? We may ask ourselves this question too late.